Got to remember to take the cover off the camera. All right. Good evening. So, we got another extra long chapter tonight for this book. Um, so I'm going to do the first half of it, and we'll go from there. We'll do the other half on Tuesday, barring catastrophe. Never know what might go on. Winter finally hit here in Montana, so that always changes things up. I'm less likely to go somewhere, but there can always be some other sort of problem. So, anyway, here we go. Chapter 7, The Emancipation of America 2, Part 2. All right. How Negroes could help emancipate white Americans. And just as a reminder to anybody that might be listening to this, I read the book word for word. I don't care what it says. I don't care if it has words in it you don't like or that white people aren't supposed to say. I'm reading a book, reading a book, reading a book. I'm not going to censor it. I'm going to read it. So if there's a word that is said, I don't give a shit. I'm reading it. That's as much of a disclaimer as you're getting. All right. How Negroes could help emancipate white Americans. If Edmund S. Morgan is right in maintaining that Americans bought their independence with slave labor, quote unquote, then the pronouncements we have quoted from Jay, Paine, and Jefferson were freighted with some of the cruelest irony in human history. American leaders could, quote, dare to speak a political language that magnified the rights of free men, end quote, precisely because they had no need to fear a dependent and exploited class of whites. Yet that very political language contributed to their abhorrence of Negro slavery and made them dare to speculate aloud about God's justice. Perhaps the speculation itself helped to confirm what Jefferson called, quote, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gifts of God, end quote. Excuse me. Perhaps a just God would make allowance for the Americans' good intentions as well as for their inability to do anything about the unfortunate source, quote unquote, of their freedom. But there was more to this conflict than irony. If the American Revolution could not solve the problem of slavery, it at least led to a perception of the problem. Nor was the desire for consistency a matter of empty rhetoric. It appeared in the anti-slavery resolutions of New England town meetings, in the Vermont Constitution of 1777, in individual wills that manumitted slaves, in Rhode Island's law of 1774 that prohibited future importation of slaves, and in Pennsylvania's Gradual Emancipation Act of 1780, adopted according to a preamble written by Thomas Paine, quote, in grateful commemoration of our own happy deliverance, end quote, from British occupation. One may doubt whether inconsistency was of pressing concern to the majority of Americans, even in New England. Of the vast number of speeches, sermons, and resolutions warning of a British plot to enslave America, only a handful made the unsettling leap to the Americans' enslavement of Negroes. During the early years of imperial conflict, the Quakers led the way in exploiting the theme of inconsistency, having blamed slaveholding, among other sins, for their own sufferings during the French and Indian War. The Quakers helped to popularize the ideal of voluntary manumission as a means of self-purification and avoidance of divine retribution. Excuse me. But the Quakers' pacifism, coupled with their suspected Tory bias, soon deprived the sect of an effective voice. The Patriots' cause won more substantial support from the liberal Protestant clergy, who had been open both to the ideals of the Enlightenment and to the latitudinarian spirit of English theology. As a group, the theological liberals may well have agreed that Negro slavery had no place in a free society, but their domestic views, like those of the majority of patriot lawyers and political leaders were moderated by a concern for public order, for property rights, and for Southern sensibilities. For a brief period, the most profound and uncompromising exposures of America's dilemma came from the Calvinist heirs of the Great Awakening. Alan Heimert has recently given us a controversial portrait of Calvinist radicals and Lockean liberals battling for America's soul. One would not one need not accept Heimert's thesis or his idealization of the quote unquote progressive postmillennialists, followers of Jonathan Edwards, in order to apply some of his arguments to the origins of New England abolitionism, a subject he oddly ignores. As Heimert convincingly shows, the imperial conflict brought out a militant, apocalyptic strain of New England Calvinism that probed the ultimate boundaries of permissible dissent. The ideas of collective accountability and collective judgment were by no means confined to the new divinity followers of Jonathan Edwards. It is highly debatable whether such quote unquote new lights were any more predisposed toward social justice than their clerical opponents. Yet it was only among New England Calvinists that traditional eschatology gave form to an anti slavery rhetoric which challenged the neo Harringtonian conception of liberty, which pointed to a more radical definition of freedom, and which anticipated the quote unquote immediatism of the later Garrisonians. The doctrines of the New England Awakening did not lead directly or necessarily to militant abolitionism, but by the 1770s, Edwards' leading disciples had come to see Negro slavery as the providential means for bringing freedom and redemption to white America. Unlike the theological liberals, the Calvinists had always insisted that God in his infinite wisdom had permitted sin and had designed a world in which evil may be the occasion for good. I'm not sure okay, I get it. As phrased much later by Wendell Phillips, an heir of the Puritans and a convert of Lyman Beecher's revivalism, quote, slavery, by the necessity of its abolition, has saved the freedom of the white race from being melted in luxury or buried beneath the gold of its own success, end quote. Evangelical Calvinism may not have been, as Heimert contends, quote, profoundly hostile to the emerging capitalist ethic of 18th century America, or a counterthrust to the seeming tendency of American history, end quote. Attempts to extrapolate political outlook from theological doctrine have met with little success. Yet it cannot be denied that the heirs of the New England Awakening approached the Revolution with a set of values and expectations very different from those of Hamilton, Jefferson, and Washington. If one is to understand their response to Negro slavery, it is first necessary to look at their changing assumptions regarding historical time, individual and collective guilt, and above all, liberty. Millennial thought has been linked both with militant rebellion and the quietistic withdrawal from the world. Sometimes postmillennialism, or the belief that 1,000 years of peace and brotherhood will precede Christ's second coming, has encouraged active effort to redeem the world. Sometimes premillennialism has had the same effect. As James W. Davidson has pointed out, 18th century millennialists were anything but consistent. They were less troubled by, quote, the ambiguities of the prophecies, end quote, than by the, quote, the ambiguities of the world, end quote. It is therefore possible to read millennial prophecies as projective fantasies, mirroring individual or collective fears, anxieties, and aspirations. Visions of an impending millennium could bridge the gap between the known world and the unknown future. They could give sanction to disruptive change, help explain misfortune, and furnish a reassuring sense of historical continuity. Yet in 18th century New England, and to some extent in all the colonies touched by the Great Awakening, millennialism also supplied a shared set of symbols and preconceptions which defined the wider meaning of historical experience. Thus, a national crisis took on the overtones of an individual's spiritual crisis, wherein the morphology of individual redemption, including the discovery of one's own sinfulness and the subsequent trials of humiliation and repentance, served as a model for quote unquote saving the nation. If millennialism cannot quite be thought of as an autonomous force or influence, quote unquote, it can be interpreted as a language that merged individual and collective needs, providing a vehicle for the transference of personal aspirations to a larger social sphere. The Great Awakening had not only condemned the depravity of the existing social order, but had aroused new faith that Americans stood within each of Christ's within reach of Christ's millennial kingdom. It is perhaps impossible for the modern secular mind to grasp the revolutionary implications of an imminent millennium, especially when it is to occur in history as the result of natural causes. Throughout the colonies, the revivals induced a heightened sense of expectancy and almost obsessive need to, quote, look for the beginnings, end quote, of the great drama of redemption. Joseph Bellamy, one of Edwards's more militant disciples, pictured the world as a participatory theater. God, who would exhibit his own perfections as the scenes came to a climax, also wanted his creatures to, quote, give a true specimen of themselves that it might be known what was in their hearts, end quote. For expectant Calvinists, the unfolding scenes included economic distress, wars with the French Antichrist, and finally, collision with British imperial authority. Already suspicious of worldly power and fashion, their imaginations superheated by struggles against popish despotism, the New England clergy were well prepared to interpret political independence as the first stage of collective redemption. A holy cause imposes uncompromising obligations. Edwards himself said that, quote, a great degree of holiness, end quote, would render, quote, a man unable to take complacence in wicked persons or things, end quote. Therefore, if the struggle for American liberty was part of the great, quote, work of redemption, end quote, there was no room for moderation or lukewarm emotion. For militant Calvinists, the question of sincerity took on cosmic dimensions. The sincere in heart were partners of God, the troops of his millennial army. To the rough militia and Minutemen, the New England clergy preached the duty to fight as soldiers for the Lord. Excuse me. It is easy to miss two radical implications of this evangelized resistance. First, the American armies were fighting not for individual liberty, but for collective liberty, not for private interest, but for the public good. Nathaniel Niles and other followers of Edwards explicitly repudiated the notion of a social compact for the protection of property and other private interests. In Niles's view, this was, quote, the maxim on which pirates and gangs of robbers live in a kind of unity, end quote. Revolutionary unity was not to be based on bribes, on the mutual protection of booty, or on any formula that apportioned power between the rich and the undeserving, quote unquote. All had an equal stake in the public good, which would be most safely defined by the, quote, voice of a majority, end quote. Fulfillment of the moral law would depend on persons of, quote unquote, a disinterested, benevolent spirit. and Niles believed, quote, that by far the greater part of these are to be found among the lower classes of mankind, and that a very small proportion of them are among the great, end quote. The second point, which Heimert ably develops, is that the resistance is that resistance to Britain became a surrogate for the kind of religious revival which was supposed to purify society, overcome theological confusion, and create an organic community. It followed that the revolutionary state must be an instrument of the divine will, enforcing the moral law and preparing the way for collective redemption. The state itself was morally accountable, and legislators could not be allowed to tolerate any form of oppression or unrighteousness. Political commitment involved changing and seemingly inconsistent images of liberty and slavery. Calvinists still talked of liberty as God's reward for obedience and of slavery as God's punishment for disobedience. Even when they defined liberty as the necessary precondition for obedience, they tried to preserve the conventional distinctions between spiritual and civil liberty, between the perfect liberty of heaven and the imperfect liberty of a sinful world. Yet Edwards' arguments had helped to blur conventional dualisms. Assuming man was free from external compulsion, Edwards had posited a necessary connection between choice and inner disposition. We, we perceive what we want to perceive. We are free only to follow our own strongest motives. Spiritual liberty, therefore, meant a freedom from being disposed to choose sin. Once transformed by grace, a man would spontaneously relish and choose the greatest good. If, however, a man were to act according to his quote unquote moral ability and hence exercise his spiritual freedom, he could not be bound by any physical or legal restraints. A threat to physical liberty was therefore a threat to spiritual liberty. Since Edwards himself had tended to take physical liberty for granted, his theology had focused attention on the absolute disparity between true and spurious virtue. But the imperial conflict enabled his followers to reverse priorities. If the struggle against England were at one with the work of redemption, it would be self-defeating to raise doubts over the moral ability of Americans. The colonists individually would have no opportunity to prove their regeneration if they allowed themselves to become enslaved by external coercion. Their collective resistance might be the providential means of offering that very proof. Some of the revolutionary Calvinists took the momentous step of identifying liberty with grace. Liberty was divine, quote, the finished work of heaven, end quote, the very, quote unquote, image of Jehovah. Like grace, it was the precondition for virtue. According to Niles, who was a student of Bellamy's, quote, the first effects of liberty on the human mind are calmness, serenity, and pleasing hope, and all the various fruits of liberty produce the same happy effects. Thus liberty first divides itself, as it were, into various streams, which at length all meet together again in soothing sensations and sweet emotion of soul. How great, then, must be the collective happiness that a community derives from a state of perfect freedom. End quote. As Heimert points out, Niles's millenarian society of quote unquote perfect liberty depended less on God's arbitrary will than on the colonists' determination to throw off British enslavement. Among the rewards are or fruits of liberty would be economic prosperity and thriving growth of the arts, sciences and purified religion. Niles and his contemporary Edwardsians did not link freedom with the independence of property. Their ideal of liberty was closer to that of Humboldt than to that of the neo-Harringtonian tradition. In a society of perfect liberty, Each individual would be autonomous in his own sphere, but would move in harmony with all other individuals, spontaneously uniting for the highest good of the whole. And since the crimes of an influential man were particularly damaging to social harmony, quote, the offenses of the great should be punished with greater indignity and severity than the crimes of persons in low life, end quote. Niles warned the people of Newburyport that, quote, a great spirit is no more inclined to enslave others than ourselves. If then it should be found upon examination that we have been of a tyrannical spirit in a free country, how base must our character appear, and how many thousands of thousands have been plunged into death and slavery by our means, end quote. Niles's central admonition sounds much like those of Benezet or Rush. Quote, for shame, let us either cease to enslave our fellow men, or else let us cease to complain of those that would enslave us. End quote. But the question of inconsistency has now taken on far subtler dimensions. Americans had not been compelled to enslave Negroes or to buy their independence with slave labor, but neither were they free from the Edwardian viewpoint to change their minds and respond to rational appeals to justice. The central question involved the state of America's soul. A free soul, as Niles emphasized, quote, is no more inclined to enslave others than ourselves, end quote. Uh, Followed by another quote. Quote, perfect liberty. Oh, that was all. Quote unquote, perfect liberty was the absolute antithesis of slavery. By definition, the two could not coexist in the same society. Calvinists thought of slavery as God's punishment for disobedience, even when they defined liberty as the necessary precondition for obedience. The key to this riddle lay in the contingency of revolutionary time. When Niles spoke of, quote, blah, a tyrannical spirit in a free country, end quote, he meant that it was not yet certain whether America would choose, in the Edwardian sense, the blessings of freedom or the curse of slavery. Liberty, he pointed out, could give no pleasure to a tyrannical or licentious people. Moreover, in a state of slavery, men exhibited, quote, a dumb, sullen, morose melancholy, end quote, spirit. This was the fate Americans might bring upon themselves, and since they held innocent Negroes in bondage, they could not expect the divine protections enjoyed by a just society. According to Levi Hart, another of Bellamy's students, the colonists were already enslaved to sin and were thus particularly vulnerable to various forms of secular tyranny. If, however, they abolished Negro slavery and were consistent with the law of liberty, quote, the hard bondage of sin and Satan, end quote, would be thrown off and they could enjoy, quote, the most perfect liberty, end quote. Emancipation of the blacks would allow Americans to fight, as Hart put it, under the banner of the Lord's host. This would ensure even more than victory. This would ensure even more than victory, since, quote, liberty shall be your lasting reward, for whom the Son maketh free shall be free indeed, end quote. Hart's millennial vision shows how far the New England clergy had gone in adopting the hopes of the Great Awakening to the uncertainties of the Revolution. Edwards's followers had long had long agonized over man's illusions of freedom, his infinite capacity for self-deception, and his blindness to counterfeit virtue. But now Americans had the opportunity to demonstrate their own moral accountability, suspending, as it were, any obnoxious doubts over the inner state of their souls. Accordingly, when England sent mercenary troops to kill, rape, and enslave Americans, this was outrageous tyranny which demanded armed resistance. Yet the colonists' sufferings were also a sign of divine judgment that called for immediate repentance and reform. Thus, in 1776, Samuel Hopkins observed that if slaveholding was, quote, a sin of a crimson dye, which is most particularly pointed out by the public calamities which have come upon us, from which we have no reason to expect deliverance till we put away the evil of our doings, this reformation cannot be urged with too much zeal, nor attempted too soon, whatever difficulties are in the way. End quote. Benjamin Coleman agreed that the nature of America's woes pointed to slaveholding as the quote unquote capital sin of these states. No doubt the colonists were guilty of many transgressions, quote, yet this crime is more particularly pointed at than any other. Was Boston the first port on this continent that began the slave trade? And are they not the first shut up by an oppressive act and brought almost to dissolution, desolation? End quote. Sorry, couldn't get that word out. Viewed from one perspective, men like Coleman and Hopkins were infusing the slavery issue with highly charged religious symbolism. From another viewpoint, they were secularizing the religious vocabulary of their Puritan forebears. However, the process is However the process is described, it amounted to more than a mechanical pouring of old wine into new bottles. The transference had momentous consequences both for religion and for the future of American radicalism. First of all, there was an imaginative conflation of freedom from sin with freedom from secular bondage, both the bondage of Negroes and the bondage with which the colonists were threatened. Again, Hopkins's language is especially revealing since he theoretically held that no man had the capacity to act righteously without the aid of divine grace. As Hopkins approached the question of divine judgment, he placed purely secular concerns, such as public safety, within a vague framework of providence. His words take us back to the quote unquote restiveness of the black population. Quote, God is so ordering it in his providence that it seems absolutely necessary something should speedily be done with respect to the slaves among us in order to our safety and to prevent their turning against us in our present struggle in order to get their liberty. Our oppressors have planned to gain the blacks and induce them to take up arms against them by promising them liberty on this condition. End quote. Excuse me. Hopkins then reveals, however, that Jehovah is in more direct command of events and will doubtless punish Americans with enslavement unless they expiate their guilt. Quote, God has raised up men to attempt to deprive us of liberty, and the evil we are threatened with is slavery. This, with our vigorous attempts to avoid it, is the ground of all our distresses. End quote. Clearly, nothing could be more foolish than to postpone emancipation to a more convenient time. Americans must arise, Hopkins warned, quote, all as one man and do it with all our might without delay, since delaying in this case is awfully dangerous, as well as unspeakably criminal, end quote. There is no quote unquote insurmountable difficulty, Hopkins confirmed, quote, but that which lies in your own heart, end quote. By making emancipation a religious issue, Hopkins came close to secularizing religious commitment. Obviously, this meant something very different from advocating emancipation as an act of Christian charity. Though Hopkins never said that men could be freed from individual sin by working for Negro emancipation, he did see individual conversion, a change of heart, as the key to collective redemption. He also pictured Negro slavery as the epitome of national sin and the cause of national suffering. Faced with the imminent threat of God's vengeance, it mattered little whether an individual American was a saint or sinner. Individual salvation would have to be of subordinate concern until the people had collectively appeased God's wrath. This frame of mind gave an almost chiliastic urgency to emancipation, reinforcing the legalistic argument that Negroes had an quote unquote equal right to freedom. The result, even outside New England, was often a sharpened sense of moral realism, which anticipated the later Garrisonians. John Cooper, for example, in commenting on Pennsylvania's Gradual Emancipation Act of 1780, warned that the Lord would not be satisfied with halfway measures. Quote, "And if we keep our present slaves in bondage and only enact laws that their posterity shall be free, we save that part of our tyranny and gain of oppression, which to us, the present generation, is of the most value." End quote. Such measures, Cooper continued, really meant telling the slaves, quote, "We will not do justice unto you, but our posterity shall do justice unto your posterity." End quote. Until Americans abandoned such hypocrisy, they could never expect to achieve liberty and peace. One source of anti-slavery immediatism can be found in the writings of secular thinkers such as George Wallace, who sought to dissociate slavery from the protective category of private property. A more vital source in America, at least, was the largely Calvinist impulse to find social correlatives for sin, repentance, and redemption. As an alternative to the prudent and rational approach of the gradualists, a more impatient morality survived the Revolution. Occasionally it found expression among frontier Calvinists. It was later nourished by Yale and Andover seminaries, which became Edwardian seedbeds for radical reform. It is therefore legitimate to see Bellamy, Hopkins, Hart, Niles, and Jonathan Edwards, Jr. as the precursors of Garrison, Phelps, Pillsbury, Wright, and Phillips. But there were grave weaknesses in the providential approach to slavery and American independence. Perhaps Calvinism advanced moral consciousness, but by insisting that liberty cannot be earned by good works. The doctrine appears to be a refreshing antidote to the more common rationalistic view that some slaves could be freed without harm, since they were better behaved than many whites. But insight had its price, even for the democratic Calvinist like Nathaniel Niles. If a freed Negro seemed to lack moral capacity, as defined by the revivals, he was not really suited for freedom. One could not demand industry, frugality, and temperance as conditions for freedom, but these virtues, in addition to, quote, "decent conversation and courteous behavior," end quote, were the necessary fruits of freedom. Slaves were not sinners, but sinners could not expect to benefit from liberty. By making liberty equivalent to grace, Niles could conclude that it would be better to be born a slave than to be guilty of abusing liberty. By making the urgency of Negro emancipation depend on the fears evoked by war, abolitionists of various kinds invited an obvious reply. The times could not be more inopportune, since it was difficult enough to mobilize the people without increasing further discord, threatening additional property, and turning loose a savage, vengeful, and propertyless swarm of marauders. Fear, in short, could be countered by fear. To be effective, the abolitionist Jeremiads required a proper timing of victories and defeats. Hopkins advanced the rather strained argument that the Americans' early military successes were a reward for the congressional resolutions ending the slave trade. He warned, of course, that the Patriot armies could expect nothing but defeat if this preparatory step were not followed by emancipation. But to anyone who took this logic seriously, the final American victory could only prove that Negro emancipation was not one of God's supreme concerns. Above all, the retributive approach focused on the guilt, fears, and aspirations of white Americans. Shocked by the harshness of British coercion, threatened with defeat and paternal vengeance, the Calvinists the Calvinist clergy searched for the hidden guilt that could account for God's displeasure. Some of them fastened on slaveholding, but usually in a spasmodic or intermittent way. Significantly, Hopkins thought it necessary to say that by emphasizing the national sin of slaveholding, he did not mean to exclude other sins, quote, such as impiety and profaneness, formality and indifference in the service of Christ and his religion, end quote. These, of course, were among the sins that had been the traditional province of the clergy, and their partial displacement by slavery was the result of an unprecedented crisis. After independence had been achieved, it would have been unthinkable for a minister like Levi Hart to assure Americans that they could throw off, quote, the hard bondage to sin and Satan and enjoy the most perfect liberty, end quote, simply by abolishing Negro slavery. One may also note their impiety, profaneness, and religious indifference are are predictably enduring problems, at least until the millennium. By linking the sin of slaveholding with these perennial human failings, the abolitionist clergy implied that the condemnation was what really mattered. If the revival's logic had been taken with literal seriousness, America might have experienced a genuine social revolution, culminating in a theocratic state. There were grim dangers, as the clergy seemed to sense, in substituting military victories for mass conversions or in portraying the state as an instrument of the Lord. By the end of the war, the clergy had already begun to compromise their millennial goals and to reaffirm the separation between religion and worldly politics. Victory, which in one sense marked the fulfillment of the revival's most daring hopes, also promoted a spirit of accommodation. In January 1788, for example, Hopkins could express dismay to Levi Hart over the news that, quote, these states which have been fighting for liberty and consider themselves as the highest and most noble example of zeal for it, could not come together in any political constitution unless it indulged and authorized them to enslave their fellow men, end quote. Yet he favored adoption of the Constitution, thinking that the alternative would be, quote, a state of anarchy and probably of civil war, end quote. Instead of being the instrument of American emancipation, the slave, it appeared, had become the greatest peril to union. Race and reality. The ideology of the American Revolution cannot be divorced from the momentous question of race. But then race attitudes cannot be taken as an irreducible and self-explanatory fact. If racial differences came to symbolize a kind of irreducible reality, one must ask what functions the symbol served. How precisely were racial attitudes related to more general questions concerning labor, subordination, social discipline, and moral progress? Winthrop D. Jordan has mapped much of this terrain in his account of American attitudes towards the Negro's physical characteristics, the self-conscious discovery, quote unquote, of prejudice, and the environmentalists' attempts to explain the Negro's various deficiencies. Deficiencies. There is something to be added, however, to his insight that Americans had reason, quote, to emphasize the physical differences between themselves and Negroes in order to confirm the validity of their social order, end quote. The anti-slavery arguments of the Revolutionary period were notably abstract and seldom touched on the actual condition, interests, or future of Negro Americans. Some of the younger generation of patriots, having a literary bent, sought to enliven the debate by writing parodies of the pro-slavery argument. This device added comic dress to lofty theory and presumably indicated which principles a writer could assume his audience would not take seriously. Thus, John Trumbull, writing in the Connecticut Journal and New Haven Postboy, was clearly confident that his Swiftian irony would not be misunderstood. Quote, It is strange, he remarked, that any persons should be so infuriated as to deny the right of enslaving the black inhabitants of Africa. Trumbull could not look on silently, and see this inestimable privilege, which had been handed down inviolable from our ancestors, wrenched out. Must have known that angry colonists were not in a mood to agree with this initial quotations from Pope. Whatever is right, and from, Machiavellius Americanus, however amiable justice and virtue may be in our abstract ideas of them, the policy of kingdoms and commercial states ought ever to be regulated by the more important considerations of necessity and convenience. Sorry, that was kind of a weird 3 quotes in a row thing. Judged by the latter criteria, even West Indian slavery emerged as one of the most efficient and beneficent institutions ever devised by man. The blacks had, fewer cares and less anxiety about tomorrow than any people in the whole world, If the people of Britain and Ireland should ever become aware of the bliss and security of colonial slavery, Parliament would have to pass stringent legislations to prevent the entire population from fleeing to, this terrestrial Elysium, Unhappily, the agitation over slavery might force West Indians to break off the provision trade with the northern colonies. Even then, however, utility could provide a sensible solution. The West Indians could find a perfect substitute for pork and ham if they pickled and smoked the bodies of the 20,000 slaves who perished every year on their trip from Africa. The revolutionary generation felt equally confident in ridiculing the notion of natural subordination. Thus, in Hugh Henry Brackenridge's Modern Chivalry, Captain Farrago scoffs at natural rights, claiming that slaveholding is justified by, the economy of nature, which everywhere illustrates, the subserviency of one thing to another, Farrago then reveals the Hobbesian basis for his position when he admits that since, it is difficult to determine a priori who are intended for slavery or freedom so as to make a judicious distribution, things must take their course, and the rule be catch can, and every man have a servant when he can get one. It is vain to be squeamish and stick at color. It is true, I would rather have a white person if such could be got, That was a weird, difficult quote. This is the anti-slavery principle of consistency, turned upside down. It also illustrates a common tendency to subordinate questions of race to questions of dominion, utility, and social order. Since Farrago rested his case on expediency and superior power, his only inconsistency was an added assurance that Negroes were not the same species as whites. Remember, this was parody. Montesquieu had provided the classic model for satirizing this latter position. It is impossible for us to suppose that these beings should be men, because if we supposed them to be men, one would begin to believe that we ourselves were not Christians. Brackenridge, among others, took up the theme. That it is justifiable, I have no doubt. Is there any religious denomination except the fanatical people called Quakers that have made it a term of communion not to hold a slave? In admitting to church privileges, I have never heard of the question asked, have you any Negroes and do you keep slaves? If it was a matter of conscience, would not conscientious persons themselves make it? But the line of argument was clearly dangerous, even apart from its anti-clericalism. It was one thing to parody abstract arguments that could be turned against any assertion of natural rights, and quite another to satirize racial antipathies, which served the important function of qualifying natural rights. In a quote unquote forensic dispute on the legality of slavery, held at Harvard's commencement ceremony in 1773, the student taking the abolitionist side realized that the argument was driving his opponent back to the defensive wall of Negro inferiority. At this point he asked, quote, "I suppose you will hardly imagine the darkness of a man's skin incapacitates him for the direction of his conduct," end quote, and added more quips borrowed from Montesquieu on slavery being justified by kinky hair or a flat nose. The reply exposed the hazard of such light attempts to dismiss the racial question. Quote, "My friend, I am no enemy to humor, but I think it rarely serves to illustrate a logical conclusion." End quote. The real issue, according to Harvard's defender of slavery, was neither physical difference nor abstract right, but the Negro's present capacity for self-determination. Since the revolutionary debates over slavery moved irresistibly to the question of race, abolitionist writers tried to focus attention on the superficiality of physical differences. Quote, "A black, tawny, or reddish skin," said William Gordon, "is not so unfavorable an hue to the genuine son of liberty as a Tory complexion." End quote. Benjamin Rush felt it necessary to begin his 1773 address to the inhabitants of the British settlements in America upon slave keeping by denying the necessity of saying anything in favor of the Negro's intellect or capacity for virtue and happiness, after which, of course, he said a good deal. And in his vindication of the same address, he added that even if Negro inferiority had been proved, quote, "would it avail a man to plead in a court of justice that he defrauded his neighbor because he was inferior to him in genius or knowledge," end quote. Such arguments were blunted by strategic and ideological barriers. The strategy of the revolutionary debate left little ground for an abstract or generalized defense of slavery. Given the widespread enthusiasm for liberty and equal rights, it was difficult for an apologist to show that the freedom of some Americans depended on the exploitation of others. He could not plead in favor of honest tyranny or unadulterated self-interest. The abolitionists, by resting their case on the highest moral principles, helped to isolate the Negro's supposed incapacity for freedom, whether inherent or the result of long oppression, as the only obstacle to emancipation. When the argument acquired this structure, it obscured the national interest served by slavery. The terms of the debate also gave a subtle tactical advantage to the opponents of abolition. As the principles of the Revolution became more hallowed and abstract, racial fears and prejudices could acquire all the symbolic connotations of reality, quote unquote. The realist could agree that the visionary, quote unquote, that the principles, or with the visionary, that the principles for which Americans had fought, to use Jordan's phrase, quote, required the complete abolition of slavery, end quote. Yet reality required that the Negro's, quote, equal right to freedom, end quote, be consigned to that pantheon of ideals which evoked rhetorical respect, but did not impinge on the immediate world of affairs. Both parties in the revolutionary debate helped to make race the central excuse for slavery. They thus diverted attention from a pattern of exploitation and of prejudice toward the exploited, which America had supposedly never shared with the Old World. Obviously, the blacks differed from other undercastes in being racially distinct and sharply segregated from the poorer classes of whites. Nor can one overlook the racial fears, tensions, and stereotypes which, as Jordan has shown, were not necessarily a product of slavery, but the reality that weakened anti-slavery ideology had less to do with race per se than with the discipline of a potentially disruptive lowest class. The question of discipline must be understood within the context of religious perfectionism and revolutionary aspirations. The newborn Christian could demonstrate his own spiritual liberty by championing the cause of the downtrodden. The nation could live up to its messianic motto, Novus Ordo Seclorum, by repudiating the principle of slavery. The blacks themselves, however, were deprived of this opportunity to act on their inner volition and thus to fulfill their inherent destiny. They did not, as a group, emancipate themselves. As a result, white Americans retained the prerogative of telling blacks what their inner volitions should be. Levi Hart, for example, could assure the free men of Farmington, Connecticut, that his anti-slavery remarks would not make the blacks unruly, since they were bound both by duty and their own interest to remain obedient. The formula allowed emancipators to define their own external behavior as an expression of internal freedom and purity. Unhappily, the objects of emancipation could be externally freed only as they gave evidence of an internal enslavement to the benefactor race. A few examples of the reformers' programs for uplift and rehabilitation will suggest that racial distinctions were not the central concern. The reformers feared, above all else, the kind of uncontrolled behavior they already associated with unruly whites, the very class of quote-unquote idle vagrants that liberals like Berg and Hutchison had wanted to have enslaved. In colonial America, the availability of Negro slaves limited the need to exploit a large mass of unskilled white labor. Consequently, for the emancipated slave, the only nearby reference groups were the remaining slaves and a marginal group of depraved whites who had refused or failed to internalize the norms of the dominant class. The really serious question, which had nothing to do with racial characteristics, was whether emancipated slaves could greatly augment this intractable population. Would the freed black fail to show up for work? Would he carouse in taverns with Jack Tar? Would Crispus Attucks, resurrected, lead mobs that defied American troops? I'm going to have to look those names up. Jack Tar, I don't know what they're referring to or who. And also the Crispus Attucks. The slave codes in the North as well as South provide suggestive images of the kind of disorder that affluent Americans most feared. Negroes, slave or free, who had time to dance, gamble, or drink, who fraternized with white beggars, vagrants, sailors, and prostitutes, who hung out at low taverns or other spots notorious for intrigue and trading in stolen goods, who defied all curfews or engaged in brawls or simply laughed at dignified authority. There were no masters who could be held responsible for the offenses of the lower order of whites, but a slave's owner could be harshly fined for lapses in discipline. European lawmakers might well have envied such a system of delegated authority over a highly visible lower class. In cities like New York and Philadelphia, on the other hand, slave owners must have wondered whether profit outweighed legal liability. As private manumissions increased in the North, even anti-slavery spokesmen looked for substitute controls that could serve the functions of slavery, especially in keeping blacks at work and insulated from the corruptions of the lower white quote-unquote counterculture. Excuse me. For example, William Dillwyn, the American Quaker who helped catalyze the British anti-slavery movement, opposed in 1774 the idea of any general emancipation. By encouraging private manumissions, he argued reformers could teach slaves to avoid idleness and to acquire habits of conduct that would fit them for liberty. When Moses Brown freed his own slaves, In 1773, he admonished them against such, quote, profaneness and wickedness as stealing, lying, swearing, drinking, lusting after women, frolicking, and the like sinful courses, end quote. The depravity of frolicking, quote unquote, appears often in the 18th century literature. Pennsylvania's proposed law for gradual emancipation provided that any Negro or mulatto found loitering or quote unquote misspending his time could be sold as a servant for 1 year under the order of 2 justices. A New Jersey, quote, lover of true justice, end quote, suggested in 1781 that factories be built in which slaves would be prepared for freedom. While aiding the economy, such factories would presumably manufacture a moral and industrious labor force. Similarly, the pious Benezet proposed that emancipated slaves be made to work under the supervision of overseers of the poor who would oblige them, quote, to act more circumspectly and make proper use of their liberty, end quote. The blacks would then be, quote, profitable members of society, and they and their children might gradually become useful members of the community, end quote. Benezet also recommended that Negroes be forced to settle and improve Western lands, quote, when not hired out to work for the white people, end quote. Oh, and another quote. Hence, both planters and tradesmen would be plentifully supplied with cheerful and willing-minded laborers. Much vacant land would be cultivated, the produce of the country be justly increased, end quote. Here one suspects it is the true reality of race. Cheerful and willing-minded laborers. The success of emancipation would not depend on the Negro's capacity for liberty, but on finding a substitute for the labor discipline of slavery. In pre-industrial America, no one could envision the social controls of 19th century industry or the staggering task of transforming an immense population of immigrants into an efficient and orderly working class. In the 1770s, the blacks' performance was a freedom could not be measured against a large existing class of white peasants and laborers. Thus, for a century or more to come, it would be measured against his previous performance as a slave. The perishability of revolutionary time. As later anti-slavery writers searched for a vocabulary that would resonate with the largest possible audience, they turned repeatedly to the examples and principles of the War of Independence. A petition of 1786 to the Virginia legislature from Frederick and Hampshire counties restated the central argument of inconsistency. Quote, that the glorious and ever memorable revolution can be justified on no other principles but that but what doth plead with greater force for the emancipation of our slaves in proportion as the oppression exercised over them exceeds the oppression formerly exercised by Great Britain over these states, end quote. To illustrate the same point, David Cooper reminded his readers of the colonists' outrage over General Howe's atrocities in Boston, especially the separation of men from their families. Yet the American people had authorized similar and far worse crimes against the Africans. Quote, in vain was the tyranny of kings, has the king, sorry, quote, in vain has the tyranny of kings been rejected, said the delegates of the 1794 Convention of Abolition Societies, while we permit in our country a domestic despotism which involves in its nature most of the vices and miseries that we have endeavored to avoid, end quote. In the less temperate words of the writer in the American Museum, the inconsistency was, quote, the most abandoned apostasy that ever took place since the almighty fiat spoke into existence this habitable world, end quote. These arguments acquired new implications as they were repeated through the post-war decades. The, quote, glorious and ever memorable revolution, end quote, kept receding into the past, secure now from any need for justification. There was inevitably a widening chasm of time between the transcendent moment of rebirth when the, quote, word of liberty, end quote, created a nation and the recurring rediscoveries of America's unredeemed sin. What was the meaning of this elongating interval? Did the persistence of slavery and thus the growing permanence of America's inconsistency mean that the revolution had been lost in both senses of that word? Would post revolutionary America be simply an extension of the pre revolutionary America, at least with respect to national sin and guilt? Or did the institutionalized inconsistency mean that America would soon acquire all the infections and diseases of the old world? The power of revolutionary ideals depended on the sense of a continuing revolutionary time, a time not simply of completion and rounding out, but a time of creation, marked by the same contingency, fears, and openness of the revolution itself. Such considerations make understandable the attempts by anti-slavery writers to find, quote, signs of the times, end quote, that would reanimate the sense of collective peril generated by the revolution. If God had rewarded the American people with military victory, he could be expected all the more to punish them for violating his covenant. In the 1780s, his displeasure over slavery became manifest in the nation's prolonged economic distress, in the dissension between states, and in Shays's rebellion. In the following decades, slaveholding provoked even more ominous signs of divine wrath. Yellow fever epidemics, warfare with Barbary pirates and Western Indians, the slave revolt in St. Domingue, the danger of being engulfed in a European war, the Barbary states by their continuing raids on American shipping, showed that whites were not immune from enslavement and thus encouraged the anti-slavery literary device of role reversal. Yet when compared with the armed might of Great Britain, Indians and corsairs were weak instruments of vengeance. Unlike the redcoats, they could hardly be portrayed as threatening to enslave the entire American people. In 1806, John Parrish was forced to rely on a more tenuous example of divine retribution for America's declension. Quote, the worm and the weevil, like any army, have entered the stacks and barns and rendered the grain in some places of little value. Our fruit trees of latter years have been remarkably smitten. The rain has been withheld at seasons in a remarkable manner, so that a shower has not been witnessed to moisten the earth for upwards of 90 days in some places. End quote. Thomas Brannigan detected signs of God's anger in the moral dissipation of his countrymen. Quote, and who that is not judicially blind cannot discover the finger of an avenging God in the greatest curse that ever befell this country? Ardent spirits, the very produce of slavery, which is our greatest scourge. End quote. When Parrish and Brannigan looked across the Atlantic, they had no trouble finding a more terrifying example of the national punishment that slavery would inevitably provoke. For there could be no doubt that God had raised up Napoleon as an avenging spirit to punish the nation that had long led the world in the slave trade. England's calamities, Parrish wrote, were the direct result of her failure to comply with the British abolitionists' petitions. This was, in fact, precisely the judgment of the British abolitionists. In 1807, for example, James Stephen suggested that God had quote unquote winked at British failings during an age of ignorance, but by the late 18th century, statesmen had become aware of the national crimes against Africa, and their refusal to abolish the slave trade had been followed by war, treason, famine, mutiny, debt, loss of specie, oppressive taxes, and now the threat of invasion. Quote, can it be denied then that we have in their great nation, great national, in this great national offense, an adequate cause of this displeasure of heaven and of the calamities which have fallen unto the country? Or can it be alleged that there is any contemporary provocation that bears any proportion to the slave trade? End quote. Ironically, Stephen went on to ask, quote, has not the hand of Providence distinguished some portion of the earth with blessings equally unusual? End quote. He meant, of course, the rising Western Empire, quote unquote, whose leaders had, quote, done much to redeem themselves from those sins to which I chiefly ascribe the calamities of Europe. Indeed, their government and legislature, with whom the cooperative responsibility in every country chiefly rests, have done all that was in their immediate power, while every state in the Union but one has long since finally delivered itself from the guilt of the African slave trade. End quote. Stephen's words inhabit, sorry, Stephen's words indicate that American and British abolitionists live in a common intellectual world, but were also separated by important situational differences. They agreed that God punishes or rewards nations through the quote unquote secondary causes of history, that the American and French revolutions had ushered in an era of unprecedented hope and peril, that the African slave trade entailed monstrous burdens of national guilt, which would either lead to horrifying retribution or afford an opportunity for moral regeneration. By 1803, however, it was England that feared quote unquote enslavement by a foreign enemy. Psychologically, the Napoleonic Wars could provide a counterpart for the millennial hopes and fears of the American Revolution, and it was during this crisis, when the tide of victory had begun to turn in their favor, that the British abolished the slave trade. This triumph consummated 20 years of often discouraging struggle and helped vindicate, as the true champion of liberty, the most powerful of France's foes. The differences between British and American anti-slavery provide a perspective on the meaning of America's revolutionary heritage. In England, it was possible to think of anti-slavery as a continuously unfolding force, hampered perhaps by temporary setbacks, but moving irresistibly toward the distant goal of universal emancipation. In 1808, when Thomas Clarkson presented this view in the first full-scale history of the movement, it could still be assumed that the African slave trade was the root evil, and that its abolition would set in motion a chain of forces that would improve the West Indian slave's condition, prepare him for freedom, and eventually emancipate him. Public policy made clear that the nation was committed as the world's strongest sea power to an international suppression of the slave trade. Abolitionists could hold the government accountable for fulfilling the national pledge of 1807. Okay, I'm just finding my ending spot because we're almost there. The American commitment stemming from the Revolution was considerably more ambiguous. Reformers might read the Congressional Resolution of 1774 against importing slaves as a pledge to begin the slow work of redeeming America, but in contrast to England, American political history showed that the opposition to the slave trade could be combined with a defense of domestic slavery. Given the natural increase in the slave population, abolitionists could not count on undermining the institution, at least after census statistics were known, simply by cutting off the supply of Africans. From the beginning, they had also been more impatient than their British counterparts and had made emancipation their unequivocal goal. As we have seen, no lower purpose would have fit the millennial expectations of the Revolution. A people who, with divine favor, could win their own freedom from the most powerful kingdom on earth should meet no insuperable obstacle in emancipating their own slaves, so long as they had the will to do so. As later anti slavery writers looked back upon the Revolution, they discovered a time of selfless commitment when the people had entered into a, quote, solemn league and covenant to vindicate the rights of man and promote national righteousness, end quote. Such dedication could be followed only by apostasy or social regeneration. The rewards for America's victory were union and prosperity, yet union required sectional compromise, and prosperity was not unrelated to the labor of 700,000 slaves. By 1785, Samuel Hopkins acknowledged that since America had been so generously rewarded despite many ominous warnings, some of his readers might conclude that slavery was not quite the quote unquote heaven provoking sin he had earlier made it out to be. There were reasons, however, why a long suffering God might have allowed the United States a reprieve. Slavery had been outlawed in the proposed state of Vermont and had disappeared in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Connecticut had all adopted acts of gradual emancipation. Even Virginia had removed legal obstructions to private manumission. Only 5 states had yet shown no disposition to promote the cause of freedom. During the 1780s, these signs were highly encouraging to the reformers who worked from Delaware to Rhode Island to secure laws prohibiting slave importations and providing for gradual emancipation. Interstate communication gave them a sense of united effort in overcoming powerful interests in implementing the principles of the Revolution, and thus in preventing any historical validation of America's inconsistency. Early in 1784, Moses Brown passed on the news that Congress had proposed the year 1800 as the terminal date for slavery in the new states and perhaps even in the existing states. In 1785, it appeared that even political squabbles could not prevent New York from joining the 3 other northern states that had adopted laws for gradual emancipation. In 1791, Jonathan Edwards, Jr. predicted that at the present rate of Congress, within 50 years, it would, quote, be as shameful for a man to hold a Negro slave as to be guilty of common robbery or theft, end quote. Many Northerners were heartened by reports, especially from Virginia and Maryland, that Southerners were beginning to doubt the profitability of slave labor. The Upper South's hostility to the slave trade could easily be interpreted as the first step toward general emancipation. Benjamin Rush hoped that even South Carolina would respond to the idealism of the Revolution and refuse to import further slaves. And that is my stopping point. That gives me a perfect place there. So we will pick up the rest of that chapter Tuesday, again, barring disaster. Um, so yeah, let's see who's still on. Well, we've got Mr. Blitzer playing Hogwarts Legacy, which is a good game. I liked it. I may play it again at some point. Hot Dog Raw Dog is also on, but I've rated him more recently than Mr. Blitzer. So I think I'll go on over to Mr. Blitzer and, well, let's make sure he's going to be on. He's been on for 3 hours. He's generally on longer than that. So, all right, I'll take us on over there, and I will see you there in a minute.